Great. All right. Welcome and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Mariela Colon, and I'm a librarian with the Civic, Cultural, and Literary Engagement Department at the Chicago Public Library. Tonight's virtual event is part of our Law at the Library series in partnership with Evanston Public Library and the Chicago Bar Association. We continue to be grateful to CBA for their continued support for this public information series. During tonight's program, we will be monitoring an online chat for questions from the audience. For Q&A following this conversation, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. We will get to them at the conclusion if time allows. I am now pleased to introduce our speakers for the evening. Olivia Lawless has extensive experience representing clients in antitrust, securities, and consumer fraud class action. She's adept at drafting and arguing motions, conducting written and oral discovery, negotiating settlements, and getting results. Before becoming a litigator, she prepared comment letters addressing SEC and CFTC guidelines and composed memorandum on ESG-related regulations. Kevin Liu is an experienced class action litigator representing a variety of financial services clients in complex civil litigation in state and federal courts throughout the country. He's handled numerous appeals, arbitrations, and dispositive motions, and is familiar with all aspects of litigations. So thank you again, both to our expert attorneys for hosting this program. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to our speakers for the evening.
My name is Kevin. My colleague here is Olivia. We're both attorneys at Pilgrim Christakis, which is a boutique firm here in Chicago. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Quick disclaimer before we get started. All lawyers say this at the beginning whenever they give any sort of presentation. So by giving this presentation, we are not your attorneys. No attorney-client privilege relationship has been formed. We're merely providing information and not legal advice. With that said, let's get to it. So as you can see, the title of tonight's discussion is Cleaning Up Your Credit. And we will provide an overview of 4 different key areas that can affect your credit, namely 1, credit reports, 2, credit scores, 3, ways to deal with debt, and 4, ways to avoid scams and identity thefts that cause you to accrue debt. So why is credit so important? When we talk about cleaning up your credit, most of the time it's talking about cleaning up your credit report. And that's different from a credit score, which we'll get to later. And the benefits of a credit report, to summarize, would be it makes it easier to get credit, i.e. a loan, and it makes it cheaper to get that loan. For example, with better credit, you can get a loan for a larger amount or for better terms, such as lower interest rates. And that largely is impacted by something called a credit report. A credit report is a file about you and all other consumers in the United States. It has a bunch of information in it. It contains information about where you live, your bills, how you pay your bills, how often you pay your bills, what kind of credit do you have, whether that's a mortgage, a student loan, credit cards. It also has information that's in what we call the public domain or the public record, such as if you've been sued in court, if you've been arrested, or if you file for bankruptcy. These credit reports are prepared by 3 major companies in the US, and they're technically called consumer reporting companies, but you may know them as colloquially credit bureaus. They are Experian, TransUnion, and Equifax. These companies, their business is to compile information about you and then sell that information to other entities that may have a legitimate business need for it. For instance, if you're applying for a loan at a bank, that bank buys information from one of these credit bureaus in order to see your credit worthiness. If you're applying for apartment lease, your landlord might buy information from one of these companies to do the same thing. Common scenarios would be applications for credit, such as opening a credit card, getting a mortgage, applications for insurance, applications for employment. So part of a background check, for example, as well as an application for a apartment rental or lease. So in other words, the importance of a credit report can't really be overstated. It impacts many aspects of your life. So it's important to regularly check your credit reports to make sure that they're both accurate and complete. So what type of information is typically on a credit report? There are four main things. One is personal information. So things such as your address, your birthday, your social security number, things that is used to make sure you are who you say you are. The second thing and the most important thing that we'll go through is credit history. So this is typically what you think of when you think of as payment history. So what kind of loans do you take out, and how are you with respect to repaying those loans? Are you on time or are you delinquent? The third thing that appears on credit reports are what we call creditor inquiries. These are inquiries where you can see whether another entity, such as a creditor or your employer or a landlord, has told or made an inquiry into your credit. So in other words, when they purchase that information from TransUnion or Equifax or Experian. And you may have heard that there are two different types of credit inquiries. One is called a hard inquiry, and one is called a soft inquiry. A hard inquiry is something that is associated typically with an application of some kind. So maybe a credit application or an application to rent an apartment. These appear on your credit report for typically 2 years before they drop off, and they have a negative impact on your credit score. More on that later. For the credit report itself, again, separate from a credit score, for the credit report, it simply shows up so that other lenders, when they look at your credit report, can see that someone else made a hard inquiry. A soft inquiry, on the other hand, typically lasts for only 1 year and does not impact your credit report. And in fact, it is only visible to you. When a lender makes a credit inquiry and looks at whether other lenders have made credit inquiries on you, they cannot see soft inquiries. Soft inquiries are typically promotional or monitoring in nature and aren't related to a application of some kind. For example, if you ever receive in the mail a letter saying you're pre-approved for a credit card, that typically had a soft inquiry associated with that, where that bank, for instance, made a soft inquiry, found that your credit profile was sufficient for that kind of promotional credit card, and then mailed you the pre-approval letter. Another common type of soft inquiry that you'll often see on your credit report is what's called an account review. That is something that many creditors perform on a regular basis, often monthly or once a year, to make sure that your credit profile matches what the type of profile they originally gave you the loan for. For instance, if you open a credit card account with a certain credit profile showing that you are on time with your payments, a creditor may, every year or so, do an account review soft inquiry to make sure that you're continuing to make payments even with your other creditors. So again, these soft inquiries do not appear to anyone else, and no one can see them except for you. Finally, the last category of information that shows up on a credit report are public record information. So if you filed a bankruptcy, if If your home was foreclosed, if you have any liens or judgments against you, and so on. So in order to know whether you need to quote unquote clean up your credit, you obviously need to get a copy of your credit report. And Congress has made it very easy to get a copy, and that is at a website called annualcreditreport.com. Under the law, each of the three major credit bureaus, so Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion, must give you, on request, a free copy of your credit report once every 12 months. And because there are three of these credit bureaus, you can actually stagger them and get a credit report every 4 months. So for instance, in January, we're in January right now, right? You can get a credit report from TransUnion. You can get another one from Experian in May, and you can get another one from Equifax in September. And you go to that website right there, so annualcreditreport.com, to get that. And you can see what these credit bureaus are reporting about you, and you can keep up to date as to that as well, every 4 months, essentially. There are also, beyond the once every 12 months per credit bureau, each of the credit bureaus will also sell you your credit report if you go beyond that one every 12 months limit. So you can order them. They're typically about 10 and 20 bucks. Not every credit bureau reports the information in the same way. There might be a lot of aesthetic changes between the bureaus as to how they display the information, but there should be a lot of overlap, and the information, for the large part, should be consistent between these reports. One other method to get a free report is when you apply for credit and are denied. When you apply for credit and the bank says, no, thank you, we're not going to offer you a credit card, or the mortgage company says, no, we're not going to offer you a mortgage, they give you something called an adverse action letter. That letter will say on it that you can request a copy of your credit report within 60 days, but you need to ask for it. So if you have a letter from a bank that says, no, we're denying your application, if you take that letter and give it to the credit bureau, they will give you a free copy of your credit report. So after you get your copy of the credit report, you can go through and take a close look at all the information. It's going to have a lot of information on it, and you can identify whether there's any information that's inaccurate or incomplete, or if it is accurate, you can confirm for yourself, okay, what's being reported about me is correct. Ooh, okay, I'll check again in 4 months. So what do you do if you find information that is inaccurate? The number one thing to do is to contact the credit bureau that issued that credit report. And all of the credit bureaus have both online dispute portals where they maintain, where you can easily submit a dispute, and they also maintain mailboxes if you prefer to send, letters or hard copies of things. In either event, whether you dispute this information online or by mail, you'll need to do it in writing. And it's much more beneficial to do that in writing than calling the credit bureau. When you dispute in writing, you obviously want to be clear. You want to include copies of any documents that support your position. So, for example, copies of account statements, if you think that the payment history is incorrect and you have account statements to back that up. You want to clearly identify each item that you're disputing and why you think that it's inaccurate. And it's also beneficial, for example, to include your credit report and circle or highlight the things that you want to be reviewed. And if you're contacting via physical mail, you'll want to send it via, a courier such as FedEx, or if you're sending by USPS, you want to send it by certified mail so that you can track that it made it to the credit bureau. Under the law, the credit bureau must investigate your dispute within 30 days and then report back to you. In addition, they must send your dispute to the furnisher of that information. So what I mean by the furnisher is, for example, if you're disputing the payment history of a bank account, they must forward your dispute to that bank and say, hey, this individual is disputing this information. The provider of that information, or the furnisher, must also investigate in tandem with the credit bureau. And if they find an error, they must let the credit bureau know. If the credit bureau finds an error, or if the furnisher finds an error, either way, if they find an error, they must fix the error, and that fix must be provided to all of the credit bureaus so that you're not going through this multiple times. So you're not disputing, for example, to Equifax and then having to dispute the same thing to Experian. If Equifax or the furnisher decide that your dispute is meritorious and warranted, they will update with Experian and they will update with TransUnion. In addition, when the credit bureau responds after that 30 days, they'll provide an additional free copy of your credit report. And if you request, the credit bureau will also send any notices of these corrections to anyone who has received your report in the past 6 months. So in other words, going back to what we were talking about earlier with credit inquiries, anyone who has inquired about your credit in 6 months, in the past 6 months, they'll receive an update saying, hey, recently a dispute was processed and an error was found. Finally, even if your dispute doesn't result in a change, in other words, the credit bureau or the furnisher says, no, we don't agree with you, you can still request that the fact that you disputed be included in your file. So there will be a notation beside that account that says the consumer disputes the accuracy of this file. So anyone else who makes a credit inquiry and gets your credit file can see, oh, this account may be delinquent, but the consumer disagrees with it. Additionally, what you can also do, in addition to disputing with the credit bureau, is you can also contact the creditor directly. And that process would be much the same as reaching out to the credit bureau. You can directly contact your bank, for example, and say, hey, this is wrong. Please investigate it. If a creditor then disagrees with you and says, no, we think it's right, then they must still notate your account to say that you disputed it. And that would appear to other creditors. Now, what if you see information on your credit report that's negative or delinquent or hurts your credit score for whatever reason, and but you know that's accurate? Well, then there's nothing to dispute because you're not going to dispute something that's accurate. What can you do? Generally, only time can cause accurate negative information to drop off of your credit report. And what's typically quoted, with minor exceptions, what's typically quoted is 7 years. So for example, if you have a late payment, 7 years later, that late payment disappears. If you have a bankruptcy, 7 years later, or for Chapter 7 bankruptcies, 10 years later, after the bankruptcy disappears off your credit file. So it does take a long time, and that's why it's important to make payments on time. Finally, if you have, finally, if you have credit accounts that aren't on your credit report, you can also ask credit bureaus to add these accounts. These accounts are typically ones where the creditor themselves are not voluntarily reporting it to the bureau, and they don't have to. There is no law in the United States that requires a creditor to report a credit account to credit bureaus. If they do, it needs to be accurately reported. But if they don't report it, then they don't need to report it. But you can ask the credit bureaus to consider adding an account. That might require a fee, and that would probably be a fairly involved process. But these days, most accounts are reported voluntarily by furnishers to credit bureaus. Now we are going to discuss credit scores and how they can impact you as well.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. And so just like Kevin was talking about how your credit report, how that shows your credit history, including all of the accounts, balances, payment history. Your credit score is equally as important, and it's a number that's calculated between 300 and 850, and it's a predictive number. So the point of this number is to kind of give the lender or whoever is loaning you the money some information on how likely you are to pay that money back. So it's a statistical number, and it's based on millions of other consumers, and it helps the lenders predict the risk. So like I said, just how likely you are to, to pay that money back and to pay it back on time. And I think everybody knows about, this range of scores between 300 and 850, but that middle number falls right about 640. And that's generally looked at as kind of the split between good credit and bad credit. So you want to be on the higher end, definitely as close to 850 as possible, but you're in a good spot as long as you're over that middle line, which is that 640 number. And kind of how Kevin was talking about how your credit report is only, one of multiple factors. It's the same thing with a credit score, just another factor that lenders look at. And so that's why it's important to get as high of a number as you can. So now we can talk about how that credit score is calculated. So there's not one exact formula that allows one of the credit bureaus to arrive at this number. So every credit bureau has their own secret sauce, and they look at different elements of your credit report when they're calculating your credit score. But there are definitely some things that we know that for sure affect the credit score, and some things that affect it more than others. So for example, the first thing on this list, the number and severity of late payments. This is definitely the most important factor for your credit score. So you want to make sure that you're not making late payments, because those late payments, that's what's adding up and dropping your credit score. You really want to make sure that you're making them on time. And if you do have one late payment or, a few, that it's more of a one-off occasion instead of making it a regular habit. The next thing they're going to look at is the type, number, and age of your different accounts. So as far as type of credit accounts, it's always a good idea to have a mix or diverse credit. So what this could look like is having a mix of installment credit and revolving credit. So for example, revolving credit, that looks more like your credit card, having a credit card account and paying that off on time, making at least the minimum payments and making sure they're not late. And then an installment credit would be something like student loans, for example, or a car loan, house loan, anything like that. So if you had a credit card and a car loan and you're making payments on time for both of those, you're in a good spot. Next is your total debt and ratio of balances to credit limits. So sometimes you'll hear this referred to as your credit utilization. And this is essentially how much debt you have compared to how much credit you have. So for example, if you have, let's say, a credit card with a $3,000 credit limit, and you have that credit card pretty much maxed out to $2,900, even if you're making the minimum payments and you're not making any late payments, that's still a really high credit utilization percentage, just because you've used up, almost all of your credit limit. So it's better to try and keep that percentage on the lower end to make sure that your accounts aren't, maxed out or right at the top of that limit. Then we have credit applications and inquiries, which Kevin talked a lot about earlier with the hard pulls and the soft pulls. And as we know, the soft pulls aren't going to affect this calculation. We're talking more about the hard pulls here, so those new credit applications. And then, of course, public records. So if you filed for a bankruptcy, if your house has been foreclosed on, anything like that is definitely going to impact the credit score as well. Things that are not considered. So just like we were saying, anything that goes into that soft pull. So looking at your own credit report, you can do that as often as you want. That's not going to affect your credit score at all. If your employer needs to pull your credit for some reason, that's not going to affect your credit score. And certainly not your race, religion, national origin, sex, salary, occupation. So your occupation and your salary, that could go into your credit application, but it's not going to play a role in your credit score. Okay, so next we have some steps to improve the credit score. So this is, once again, there's no magic answer for improving your credit score. It's a dynamic number and it's going to take time. You can't, improve it drastically overnight. But there are little steps you can take that if you do them on a consistent basis, you'll see your credit score rise. And just as we talked about in the last slide, the most important thing is making your payments on time and making those on-time payments consistently, just because this will really help increase your credit score. Even if that debt that you're paying is small, it really doesn't matter how much the debt is that you owe, as long as you're making those payments on time. Next is avoid applying for credit frequently. So just like we talked about with the hard pulls, if you're applying for, 1 or 2 new credit cards, it's really not going to affect your credit score too severely. It may drop it a few points. But if you're applying for lots of credit, that's a sign to lenders that you're taking on lots of debt. So when they see that you're taking on more debt, they're going to be more hesitant to loan you money. And so that in turn is going to drop your credit score. So it's just something, to think about, that just to be cognizant of how much credit you're applying for and how frequently. Next is keeping your balances under control. So we also discussed this one a little bit, but making sure that, those credit cards aren't maxed out. If you can, paying more than the minimum payments, just to try and get a higher percentage between the debt that you owe and the overall credit that you have. And then last, this is an important one, paying off debt instead of moving it around. So sometimes what we hear about people doing is taking out another credit card to pay debt on an old credit card. This isn't typically a good idea because, there's a lot of fees associated with moving funds between different credit cards, like fees for a cash advance, fees for a balance transfer, that type of thing. And then if you continue to use both credit cards and, you're taking out even more debt and, you could increase your balance due even higher. So just one thing to think about is instead of, trying to kind of get around it, just to focus on paying it instead of moving it to different credit cards. Okay, so we talked about the credit report and the credit score. But for a lot of folks, you might already be dealing with debt and you might not be as worried about maybe what your credit score is or what your credit report shows, and maybe more concerned about, just making it through and figuring out what you're going to do with the debt that you have right now. So the first thing to remember is that you're not alone. A lot of people have financial struggles. A lot of people are dealing with debt. I'm still paying off my law school debt. There's, a lot of people that are dealing with difficult financial situations. And, even though it feels very overwhelming at times, it doesn't have to go from bad to worse. And there's a couple options that we'll discuss that can help you deal with debt if you already have some. So the first bullet on here is to develop a budget. And I know that sounds pretty common sense, but it is important. And if nothing else, building a budget really helps you see where your money is going. So even if you're not, changing your goal as far as saving or spending, but as long as you're visualizing where your money is going, that can be helpful. And there's a lot of resources online that can help you with creating a budget. But essentially, what you're going to want to make sure that you have in your budget is that you list the income that you're bringing in, so from all sources. And then you want to list your expenses in different categories. So you want to have your fixed expenses, and then you also want to have your variable expenses. So for example, your fixed expenses are going to be what shows up every month. So you're going to have to pay your rent every month. You have to pay your car payment, your car insurance every month. Those type of bills that aren't going to change. So those you have to make sure that they're included in your calculation. And then your variable expenses will be things like how much money you spent eating out this month, or shopping, or, maybe gifts for friends or family, things like that that change every month. And then once you write down all your expenses, you can prioritize the variable expenses versus the money that you want to put towards dealing with your debt. So the goal is, of course, to make sure that you meet your basics every single month, but also to try and figure out the best plan for you for putting money into paying down that existing debt. And so, like I said, even if you're not really changing your saving or spending plans, as long as you're visualizing where your money's going and you know where that's going, that can be helpful all on its own. Next on here, we have contacting your creditors. So this is definitely one I think that people don't think about right off the bat. But let's say that you're having trouble paying off your credit card bill. There's always an option to call the bank that's in charge of that credit card and let them know your situation, let them know that, you're having trouble making ends meet or that you're going through a hardship. And a lot of times these financial institutions, especially some of the larger ones, will have hardship programs where they'll either be able to, offer you potentially a lower interest rate for a set amount of time, or maybe they'll be able to work out a modified payment plan with you so that the account doesn't, charge off into collections, different things like that. Because at the end of the day, they want you to pay that bill and they want to help you be able to pay that bill. So it's always worth a try reaching out to your creditor directly and just letting them know what's going on. Okay, dealing with debt collectors. So this can be a very stressful situation for anyone. No one wants to be harassed, called all hours of the night. So it's important to know that as a consumer, you do have rights against certain debt collection practices. So there's a federal statute. It's called the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, and it regulates what a debt collector can and cannot do. So some of the things to look out for that a debt collector should definitely not be doing, and if they're doing this, they're breaking federal law. They should not be calling you before 8 a.m. or after 9 p.m., so only during the day. They definitely can't call your employer or call you at work. They can't harass you. They can't make threats or lie to you about things. And another important part of this federal statute is that it allows you to dispute the debt. So let's say that a debt collector is trying to collect on a credit card bill that you didn't charge. Maybe it was the result of identity theft. You're allowed to dispute that debt in writing, and that debt collector has to provide validation of the debt to you. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And if you send a written request to the debt collector that you do not want them to contact you and to stop contacting you, they also have to honor that. So those are some things to keep in mind with debt collectors. And then the next thing on here is debt consolidation. So this can help. The main goal of debt consolidation is to take a high interest rate and, when debt is under an account with a high interest rate and move it to another account with a lower interest rate. So I know I said earlier, normally it's not a good idea to transfer, to take out a new credit card just to transfer debt from one credit card to another credit card. One exception to that would be if maybe you're transferring to a credit card with a 0% APR. Or, there's a program where you're able to transfer that debt to a lower interest rate account. That could be helpful. Another option to consolidate debt are home equity loans or home equity line of credit. So that's kind of when you're taking out like essentially a second mortgage on your home. And although there's a lot of risks to this, it could increase your chances of foreclosing on the property just because now the lender has that house as their collateral. It also allows you access to cash, right? So you could use that cash to pay off some of your high interest debts. So it's one thing to think about, but definitely to also be cautious about. And then the last thing on here is bankruptcy. And obviously this is a last resort. It's not something that anyone enters into lightly, and mainly because this stays on your credit report for 7 to 10 years. And it can make it very difficult, for your life in the future as far as obtaining credit, a mortgage, those type of things. But for some people, it is a valid option, and it can provide a fresh start. So it's an option for people as as kind of a last resort. Okay. So our last topic is avoiding scams and dealing with identity theft. So avoiding scams, I'm sure everybody knows someone who has fallen victim to some type of financial scam. It's, there's a lot of horrible scammers out there that can take advantage of people pretty easily. Especially when you're feeling overwhelmed with maybe debt or making payments, it can be easier to fall victim to certain types of financial scams. So it's important to keep in mind that anyone who's offering you help with solving your debt problems may not have the most genuine intentions. So you always have to do your own research. So make sure that you're looking up the company online. Maybe you're looking them up on the Better Business Bureau, or you're looking them up on, Consumer Protection Agency, just to make sure that you're doing your research and, being wary of these companies that are saying that there's a quick fix to your debt, because we know there's really no quick fix. It's more of a process over time. So as far as some credit repair scams, so we have on the slide the Credit Repair Organization Act. So what this does is it's another federal law that regulates companies that are offering these credit repair solutions. So if you know your rights under this act, it can be helpful for identifying, debt collection credit repair organizations that might be scamming or, not having your best financial interests at heart. So some things to look out for if you do decide to work with a credit repair organization would be to make sure that the credit repair organization, they can't charge you anything until they've given you the services that they've promised. So if any of these organizations are asking you to pay upfront, you know that that's a bad idea, that that's a scam, just because they can't charge you anything until they've given you the service that they promised. Another important thing to know is that these organizations can't perform services unless they have your written signature. So you have to actually sign a contract, and there is a 3-day waiting period. And during that 3-day period, after you sign the contract, you have the right to cancel it at any time without paying any fees. So if the organization that you're looking at isn't giving you that 3-day waiting period, or if they aren't having you sign a contract, those are some major red flags to look for that, this might be a scam. And the last thing is that any contract with these credit repair organizations needs to contain all the details of what the organization is going to be doing for you. So they have to, lay out exactly what they're guaranteeing you. They have to include their name and their address, how long it's going to take to achieve what they're promising, and, a detailed description of what they're promising, along with the total cost of how much you're going to need to pay for these promised services. So just knowing that if you are looking into a credit repair organization, making sure that they're meeting, all of these steps, and that they're complying with the law so that we know that they're more likely to be legitimate. Okay, and then we have identity theft and fraud. So identity theft, there's a lot of different ways that you can fall victim to identity theft. One, could be maybe somebody gets access to your credit card information when you're swiping it at the gas station, and they have one of those swipers set up that records your information. Or maybe your employer is hacked and somebody gets into those files at work, and they, are able to get your information or your social security number. We see data breach stuff all the time, but, there's lots of different ways that your identity could be stolen. And so with that in mind, and because we know that even if you take all the precautions in the world, it could still happen, it's important to protect yourself proactively. So some things that you can do: first of all, make sure you're reading your credit report and looking at your credit report and your credit score regularly, making sure you're checking on that, getting your free credit report when you can, just really staying on top of all of that type of information. Making sure that you're being secure with all of your devices, using strong passwords, using a paper shredder when you have to print documents that have personal information. Just, making sure to be really careful about your sensitive personal information. And then if you do find out that your identity has been stolen, or somebody's, been able to get a hold of some of this information, what you can do is you can place different fraud alerts on your credit cards or on your credit accounts. You can shut them down entirely. I'm sure you guys have done this. I've done this in the past where I've had a credit card stolen and I have to, close the account entirely, different things like that. And you can also file a report with the police. That's something you can always do. For the FTC, they have an online complaint portal where you can file a complaint online through them as well. So the main thing is just to make sure that you're proactive, that you're staying on top of it, and if something does happen, you can catch it right away. And I think that brings us to the conclusion of our presentation. And we wanted to make sure we had some time for questions at the end.
Yes, we're going to conclude the recording of the lecture portion of the presentation. Thank you both, Olivia and Kevin.